All right, we're on. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this iBiology and NRMN iBio Hangout. Today, we're going to have a live Q&A, and we're going to be discussing how you can plan and own your career, particularly using a tool called an individual development plan, or IDP, as we'll be referring to it throughout the conversation. And so today, we have the pleasure of having Bill Lindstaedt from the University of California, San Francisco. He has been helping scientists and engineers make career decisions for over 20 years. Since October of 2014, he has served as the executive director of the umbrella unit known as Career Advancement International and Postdoctoral Services, comprised of 3 offices at UCSF. The Office of Career and Professional Development, International Students and Scholars Office, and the Postdoc Office. Was director of the Office of Career and Professional Development at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. And in addition to his leadership responsibilities, his career advising work focuses on helping predoctoral and postdoctoral research scientists with their career and professional development issues. He is the co-author of the tool we're going to be discussing, or one of the tools we're going to be discussing today, My IDP, or My Individual Development Plan, which is a popular career development tool hosted by Science Magazine's career site. He has a bachelor's in chemical engineering from Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology and a master's degree from the Joint Counseling Psychology and Higher Education Student Affairs programs at Indiana University. So thank you so much, Bill, for being with us today. Welcome to this live Q&A, and welcome everybody who's watching. So I wanted to start with a really simple question. What is an IDP? What's an individual development plan?
Mm-hmm. So I think hopefully a lot of our participants are graduate students and postdocs who may already have at least heard of the term IDP, Individual Development Plan. And most people, I think, they think of an IDP as some kind of a product. It's a piece of paper that you have to produce when your PI or your grant manager or some person makes you do it. And that's the myth that we want to explode here in the next hour, is to make it more to have people perceive it as a process that's really useful in helping them, achieve their long-term goals and really take charge of their careers and sort of own what the outcomes of all their training are going to be. So people think it's a product, a piece of paper that they have to produce, and instead we want to get people thinking of it as the process of career planning, and I'll say more about that shortly. But in the end, there is usually some sort of a document that's produced where you write down your long-term career goals. So you answer the question, where am I headed with my career long-term? And then you answer the question also, how am I going to achieve that goal? So what am I going to be doing in the next year? It's a good thing to do these on an annual basis. What am I going to be doing in the next year so that I achieve that long-term goal? So really, I think this piece of paper that you produce, or whatever kind of document you create that is your IDP, should accomplish 3 things. It should answer the question, where am I headed with my career? How am I going to get there in the next year? What things am I going to do to advance myself? And the third one is, when you're done, it should be some sort of it should provide structure for you to go meet with mentors and advisors who can help you achieve your goals. And so I think those are the 3 main things that an IDP should do.
And how does the process of completing an IDP, you talked about, yes, there is usually a document, and if people go to My IDP, they'll see that there's questions that you have to answer that kind of help you to go through this process. But what are some of the important parts of the IDP process? Like, if you don't want to use a particular tool, but you still want to go through the process of thinking about creating a plan that will help you achieve your career goals.
Mm-hmm.
How does that process look like?
Yeah, so this might be a time to share with our participants the document that I sent, which is sort of a visual diagram of what you could go through, the steps you would go through in order to create your own IDP. And this is the.
Can you see that?
I can see it. It looks great. Thanks.
Okay.
So there's basically 4 phases of the IDP process. The career development, or sorry, the individual development planning process. And the first thing we think everyone should do is, on an annual basis, just take a step back and think about what you've accomplished and sort of do this self-assessment piece and reflect on your skills, your interests, and your values. And to be a little more specific, skills are the tasks that are involved in a career, for example. So if you're at the bench every day as a graduate student or a postdoc, doing your research, what are the skills that you're really good at, and what skills do you need to improve on? And then those should be both a present look at how you're doing right now, but also if you consider the next step in your career or the step after that, what skills are going to be required for you to be successful, and what do you need to do in order to achieve those skills and improve on those skills so that you can be successful in the next steps of your career. And then also reflect on your interests, and interests in career counselor speak. I'm a career counselor. Interests are the tasks that are involved in a career and whether you like doing those or not. So skills are how good are you at these tasks, and if you break down a job into the different tasks, do you like doing those tasks or not? So it's useful to think pretty frequently about maybe I'm really good at something, but do I like doing it? Or is there something I love to do that I really need to improve my skill set, so that I can continue doing the thing that I love in the future? And then the values piece are the rewards or outcomes that you want from your work. So the idea with the self-assessment process, this first phase of the IDP, is to sit down and just take an inventory of whether the current work that you're doing or the career steps you're thinking in the future are going to involve tasks that you're good at doing, tasks that you like to do, and if all of those tasks that you do every day at work are going to give you the rewards and outcomes you want. And it seemed useful to have that inventory of your skills, tasks, or skills, values, and interests present with you when you move on to the next step of the IDP process, which is career exploration. And that's when you take a look at all of your career options that are facing you and evaluate those in terms of your skills, values, and interests. So perhaps your current goal is to be a research PI at a major research university, and it might be helpful for you to say, in order to achieve that, I'm going to have to get a lot better at grant writing or manuscript writing in order to be successful on the job market as a PI. And that would be one way of evaluating your taking the career exploration approach to evaluating a career path in light of your skills. Some people identify tasks that they think they find less engaging. So I know that as a future PI, for example, I may not like this particular type of, I don't enjoy doing this particular type of research. And so maybe that's the first postdoc that I'll hire as a PI in the future. And I think about, that person could help me backfill those tasks that I don't like, which will allow me to enjoy the career more. So that's sort of the career exploration process. Take a look at what you know about yourself, think about where you're heading, and look for ways to make that a better fit for you. The goal setting process then is, once you are confident that a career path is what you're looking for, start writing down some more specific goals that will help you, improve the skills that you need, or accomplish the tasks. Maybe you need to, achieve write a paper before you move on to your postdoc, for example. And so the best thing to do is to break that down into some achievable sub goals and steps so that you can move on to that. And then finally, once you get all of your goals written out, you need to get help from mentors to implement those plans. And then this becomes you see the sort of fourth arrow on there. This becomes a repetitive process, so that on an annual basis, you're taking inventory, seeing how you fit with the career goals, the career track that you're on, set goals, and get your mentors to help you again. And then I think I mentioned before, if you go to the next slide, the second slide that we had, the product that you create. So when you get all this stuff written down in this process, it ends up answering these two questions, which are, where am I headed in my career, and how am I going to get there?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, so one of the ways I kind of think about the IDP process is kind of like the way you ideally should be doing experiments. Like, you're doing something and you're assessing, and then you're kind of looking, all right, where am I going?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that's one way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that I find helpful when I was a student.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of think about that approach is like, you wouldn't be doing experiments blindly, and like, you wouldn't go, well, hopefully you wouldn't go, or as a postdoc, you wouldn't go 5 years with like, I'm going to go do all of these experiments.
Right.
You're constantly assessing and reassessing, how are things going? I'm moving towards this particular goal of getting these results. And so you're planning steps on how to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's similar, thinking about your career kind of as an experiment, but hopefully not as an experiment.
Not a total experiment, but there's some flexibility that needs to be brought to this process. Yeah, so what you said made me think of two things. One is a famous quote from the book Alice in Wonderland, where the author Lewis Carroll said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Yeah.
And I always think, if you don't have a goal for the outcome of this really difficult training you're going through, if you don't know where it's headed, why would you pick such a challenging route as graduate school or postdoc training in the sciences? It's rewarding, and yet it's a lot of work, and you owe it to yourself, I think, as a trainee to determine what you want the outcome to be, and then to take a structured approach to achieving that outcome. That's one thing. The other thing that comes to mind is the flexibility that needs to be built in, because there's no certain outcomes. And so we have students here at UCSF who will, do a very careful career plan with their IDP, and then get so attached to that outcome. Like, I know I want to be a researcher at, a big biotech company in the Bay Area, and it has to be this particular company. And they get so focused on a specific narrow outcome that it becomes disappointing if that doesn't come through for them. And so we try to encourage people to realize that there's probably a lot of ways to get to work at Genentech if that's your goal. It may not be immediate. Maybe you take another company's route back to that company, but there's a lot of options that become open to you. And so being a little flexible with those outcomes is useful.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's more than one way. And I mean, I think that's something that's very important for trainees to understand, that there are multiple paths to one goal. And so that's why I think a tool like this one and a process like this one is so important, so that you can figure out those multiple ways in which you can meet your career goals. I think you've already alluded to some of this, but why was this tool? Why was this process created? What was the need that you saw?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was kind of brought into this project, the project of creating my IP, after it, I would say what would we call him? The father of IDPs, at least in this training community, Phil Clifford, who is now an associate dean at University of Illinois, and has been doing research for decades. It continues to have his own lab. He looked at his trainees and noticed that oftentimes trainees that he worked with, whether they were in his lab or not, depended too heavily on the PI to, designate their outcome, or depended too heavily on the process of training, which is, I'm a great undergraduate student, so I'm automatically going to go to graduate school. I'm automatically going to do a postdoc. I'm automatically going to become it's a very linear process, right? And so he said he was taking a look at what are some tools that people could use so that you push the responsibility on the student for their, or on the postdoc for their own success, which just makes sense in any career, except in science training, it seems like it's so narrowly focused and stepwise that people get, they forget that that's their responsibility, is to be in charge of their outcomes. So back in the early 2000s, actually, Phil and a bunch of people in the Experimental Biology Society, called FASEB, published a very brief document that was called an IDP for postdocs. And that was a super, it was a paper-oriented sheet that you would fill out, and very general. And one of the first steps it had, just like in the diagram I just showed to everyone, was self-assessment. And there were some instructions, but the feedback that he and the team that put this together got from postdocs all over the country was, we don't know what to do in this self-assessment process. It would be great if we could name what our skills are, but we need some help. It'd be great if we could outline what rewards we want from our future work, which is what you're telling us to do in this document, but we don't know how to do that. And so I got involved as a career counselor who works with scientists, as Phil was trying to bring more specificity to this project. And we brought in the other authors who are involved with my IDP, Jen Hoban and Cynthia Furman, and sort of built it from there with a grant from the Burroughs Wellcome Fund. So it was actually a tool that was probably 6 or 8 years in the making, actually. And to summarize what I was saying, the goal of that was, can we produce some sort of an online tool that helps people take charge of this process and leads them through basically a self-guided tour of career planning, and results in some sort of a document that helps them achieve their goals.
Cool. So it was really meant to be a tool to kind of empower trainees and kind of give them independence, in terms of really what the essence of our conversation is today, and how you can own your career as you're going through your training as a grad student, as a postdoc, and even at earlier or later stages of academic training. So one of the questions that we have from the audience, I think, is related to this topic, so I'm going to bring it up. Mm-hmm. So Tammy asks, what do you see most trainees getting hung up in the process of doing the IDP? You mentioned that the IDP was created because they were kind of getting hung up on the process and depending on their PIs or their principal investigators, their advisors for this. But now that you have these tools, what are some of the bottlenecks, if we can call them that trainees you need to pay attention to while you're going through the process?
I can think of two. And the first one is, at least with the My IDP tool, it's kind of fun to work. I think that's the feedback we get. People find it fun to work through the first few steps, which is these are self-assessment, and I'm going to think a lot about myself and how my skills and my values and my interests are aligning or not right now in my career, and where I want to head in the future. I think people find that part rewarding. And then there's as you move through the menu of the My IDP tool, it takes you to a step called My Career Path Matches, where your unique responses to your skills and interest surveys point through an algorithm that we wrote and some data we collected from career counselors around the country. It points you to certain career paths that you might want to begin exploring, and it orders those career paths. It rank orders them according to how well your skills and interests align with the data we collected about those career paths. And people find that fun as well. Someone described it as it's like in the Harry Potter movies, the magic sorting hat that said, you know, Harry Potter should be a Hufflepuff or a whatever it was. There's a little bit of a black box in that process. And so I think, in answer to your question, I think the first pitfall that people sort of run into is putting too much stock into that answer. So the goal of that My Career Path Matches section was just to give you an idea about what a lot of other people think are the skill and interest priorities of that particular career path. And so my IDP was not meant to take the hard work away from deciding what you want to do with your life. It's just that tool is supposed to help you give a start on your career exploration. And that leads me to the point of where the pitfalls are in this process is career exploration. That second phase of the My IDP process is hard work, and taking, you know, a career path. Like, say I'm mainly on the academic PI path, but I have a friend who's a medical science liaison for a pharmaceutical company, and she's really happy, and I'd like to learn more about that career path. And, you know, going out and meeting multiple people who are doing that, which would be a great way to help you decide if that's a career path, and considering, you know, the information you're gathering about a career and mapping that back to your skills, values, and interests. That's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time. But we think people should spend, you know, a few hours per week during a period of time. Like, take 6 months, I'm going to do career exploration, and go out and meet as many people you can, read as much stuff from my IDP's resource list on any career path you're interested, and really think about what's involved in that career and how it maps back to your skills, values, and interests. And if you do this in a structured way, you'll be able to come out with a higher level of confidence that the careers you're considering are the best fit for you. So that's the first thing, is people don't want to do, or people don't have time often to do the work that's involved in that career exploration. I'd say the other place that we know from tracking the progress that people make in the My IDP tool. So when you set an account in My IDP, we ask for very little information about you, but we can track aggregate issues from people's profiles. And we know that there's a big drop-off when it gets to the goal-setting part. So people are like, yeah, I'm going to go through lots of fun stuff to think about myself, and then I'm going to read a bunch of stuff on careers, but now I actually have to say what I'm going to do for the next year in order to achieve my goals. That's a part that's less fun, but no less important if you're going to actually have the outcome. So people need to stick with that, actually writing down what they're going to achieve. And I might add that I think that's the hardest step, is to, you know, break what you're going to do down into steps and put timelines on them and set yourself some deadlines. That's challenging work. There is some data that shows it's worth it. There was a study done in 2005, I think, not long after Phil Clifford and his team started promoting IDPs, of postdocs and graduate students, actually just postdocs nationwide. And one of the outcomes that they showed from this study was that when they looked at all kinds of factors associated with the success of a postdoc, how many papers they published, how many grants they submitted, how many conflicts they reported in their lab, and how highly they rated their advisor, all these factors that you would want in a postdoc. You want to publish papers and write grants and get along with everybody. People who had a plan compared to those who didn't rated their postdoc experience much higher, and they were much more productive. So this idea of sitting down periodically, mapping out where you're headed and how you're going to get there, getting some help from mentors, actually was correlated with success. So it was a pretty good study.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, I mean, my experience, I'm not a professional counselor, but I do work with grad students a lot. And one thing that I found interesting was that once they get to that kind of like, that document or that part of the IDP that matches your skills, with possible careers.
Mm-hmm.
My experience is that I think scientists, we tend to be kind of prescriptive. It's like, give me steps that I can follow and I will do that.
Yes.
And I have talked to many students that are kind of thrown off because they're like, well, this says that because I like writing, 85%, like I match this career 85%, and I'm sure that I don't want to do that. And, I think people have to be mindful that this is a tool. I see it as a process, first of all, but it's also a tool to get you thinking about what other things, your skills, your values, or interests, can they fit? I have heard from students that said, oh, I was highly matched with this particular career that I didn't know existed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also about keeping your options open. And then in terms of setting the goals, I think something that is really, it is really hard. And I think because trainees are often really overwhelmed and have so much to do,
Yes.
It's easy to think that you must be focused on like constantly going. And we tend to see as taking time off to, take a step back and really think about what you want to do next. I think some people may perceive it as a waste of time, but the reality is that it's not. It is incredibly important. Self-reflection it's incredibly important for people to achieve, to figure out their career goals and how to get there. And so I think that this process of developing or creating an individual development plan, it's critical. It's critical for that. And, in terms of goals, I know that, people talk a lot about SMART goals. So goals that are, what is it? I forget what it stands for. Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And so, I would suggest to people when they're thinking about their goals, and it may seem that it can be daunting to kind of think about them in this perspective. But I think your goals within this SMART framework, I find it easier because you're thinking about what's going to be the outcome. It's not abstract, but they become more concrete.
Yeah. A couple of things. I want to go back a little bit to the career match piece and point out a couple things without being able to call up the website and demonstrate to everybody quickly. I think one thing that really helps people understand the career path matches page on my IDP is if they notice that they can click on the percentage match number and it pops up a series of bar charts that shows how task by task associated with that career, how their skills match or don't match the skills that the career advisors that we got, the survey that we took, said they need to be good at. So, and the same goes for interest. And it really helps. So I've had a number of students come in my office and say, I'm really, passionate about being a PI at a research university, for example. But I took my IDP and it says that I should not be a PI at a research university. I'm like, well, that's not what it said. That wasn't the intent, was not to say what you should or should not do. You can do anything you want. But at the same time, let's look at those, let's pop up those skills matches. And, if you think about the life of a PI, it makes sense that you have to be a pretty darn good grant writer, right? Have you ever written a fellowship or grant? And they're like, oh no, I have never tried that. So how did you rate your skills when you filled out my IDP on grant writing? Like, oh, I put myself a 1 out of 5. Well, the algorithm that we wrote would negatively weight or highly weight a negative response to that, and that would impact your match. So as you get more experienced in your career, you'll write more grants and fellowships, you'll get better at that, and you'd be able to go back and say, I'm actually a 5, I'm an excellent grant writer. And you'd see how that moved up the ranking for your fit with a PI. So once people understand where it comes from, it kind of makes more sense, and it allows them to take a step back and say, oh, I don't have to put too much stock in what this tool said about my future career prospects. The second thing I was thinking about is when a user of my IDP is pretty confident about where they're headed in their career. Like if they come like, I know that I want to be, you know, a science policy person in my future, then this whole my IDP process, all those 4 phases, actually doesn't take that long every year. So you're talking about the goal setting process and writing SMART goals. I'd say you could do it in an hour and a half once a year, and really have that, you know, that your set of goals mapped to a timeline. And some people like to, you know, actually print it out on paper and post it next to their bench, and they can see month by month what their main goals were. That doesn't take that long, and it seems to be really useful in helping people organize their year. The piece that takes a lot of time is when you have to stop in that career exploration phase and say, I thought I was on the science policy route. Now I'm not so sure about that. Let me go back and explore what my options are. And that part takes a long time. Yeah. So people ask me frequently, how long does it take to do, you know, an IDP? And I'm like, well, as little as an hour and a half. But if you need to stop in that career exploration phase, it can take you, you know, on and off. It can take some people months of work, so they can get to the point where the goals that they're writing make sense.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, if you have to go into heavy career exploration, then, you know, you have to probably read and set up informational interviews and like
Absolutely.
find people that you can talk to.
Right.
But I really want to emphasize it is a worthy process. It is a worthy use of people's time.
Yeah. And everyone I know that goes through that process of, you know, going out and setting an appointment with, you know, that science policy person that they want to learn more about, and having that conversation and then coming back and thinking about how that fits. Everyone says it's actually fun.
Yeah.
And so rewarding and fun, I would say.
Yeah. So it's a worthy use of your time, and have fun with it.
Exactly.
So one of the questions, I think there's 2 questions from the viewers that I find really interesting, and I'm going to kind of combine them. So now I think the NIH is requiring that people do this. So some trainees do an individual development plan, and there's also graduate training programs that are requiring their students to do this. And I've heard a variety of opinions of how much people are using it and how people are actually leveraging it. So one of the questions that we have from Kishore, hi Kishore, is like, what percentage of grad students and postdocs are using the IDP in the way that it is intended or described to be used? And, you know, what are the trends of adoption in terms of how people are using it?
So I don't have specific data. What the NIH says is for a PI who is either a training grant director or has their own research grant that pays for a postdoc or a student to be you know, funded by that grant. Everyone associated with the funding related to that grant who is a trainee should be doing some sort of an IDP every year. The way they make the PIs account for that is in their annual progress report back to the NIH. The PI has to describe the use of IDPs in their whatever their lab or in their training program or whatever that applies to. Because that's so the NIH doesn't say you have to do an IDP. The NIH says you have to report on how you're using IDPs, which is kind of the same, I guess. Well, so what a lot of graduate programs and postdoc programs, postdoc offices around the country have said is we're going to require everyone at our institution or in our program to do an IDP so that it doesn't have to be lab by lab focused. Other institutions like our own have taken a lab, you know, a group by group approach to it. So we're not dictating institution wide at UCSF what everyone has to do. I think either approach is fine. But the way the NIH sort of wrote this requirement, I think it winds up with us. No one really knows what percentage of all trainees are using IDPs effectively or not. We know that we have about 105,000 users now for my IDP, which that particular tool is being widely adopted. But I also think there's no reason that my IDP has to be the standard. We don't necessarily even want it to be. And it actually reminds me of, I think, a paper that we're going to link to this Hangout. The website is a paper that was published in, I think, Molecular Cell by Angela DePace's lab at Harvard. And the whole lab got together and described how they collectively have approached the IDP issue. And they don't use my IDP. They use a very simple form that's attached to as a supplemental material of their paper. And basically the PI just has a really in-depth conversation once a year with each trainee, and they write out, together, they write out what they're going to do, as well as look at how progress has been made. And it's different from, like an annual meeting that the thesis committee meeting that a lot of students have, which is focused so much on the research. This is really focused on the career and accomplishments of the student and what they plan to do for the next year. In very simple form. And so I think there's a lot of different ways that people are approaching IDPs. The very structured My IDP process, this less structured process like some labs are adopting. But we don't have good data on saying how many people are actually getting through it. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, no, and we'll definitely link the paper and some other resources to the page, to the live Q&A page on the iBiology website, so that people can check it out. And then related to that, and I never thought about this. This question is coming from Adele Monteblanco, and she's talking about tracking. And her question is successful completion of the annual IDP skills and tasks an appropriate assessment for postdocs success from the perspective of a supervisor?
Well, I think it could be. So I think, particularly with the skills inventory, there's actually on the My IDP tool, there's a little link. If you're on the skills assessment page, there's a link to where you can have it print off an email that goes to whoever you want it to, like your PI, for example, if you're a trainee or a postdoc. And you could say, I filled out this skills assessment for myself. I'd appreciate it if you would, fill out your assessment of my skills in these 47 different skill areas. And then I'd like to have a chat about, where we agree or where there are discrepancies, because, at the places there are discrepancies, I may want to set some goals around how I'm going to improve. So it doesn't have to be your PI. It could be any mentor or a colleague. But I think it's useful for people to compare their own perception of how they think their skills are to how others. And often I see that we do a lot of workshops on using My IDP, and I'll walk around the room and sort of see how people have, what patterns I see on their My IDP results. And students tend to be pretty harsh on themselves, and so sometimes, you're kind of afraid to say, I'm going to get feedback from other people, but usually the feedback I get is, other people recognize potential in me and rated me higher on certain things than I actually saw in myself. And so that can be a very rewarding experience too.
Yeah, and so actually I'm going to go to one of the questions that we had thought about before our conversation. You mentioned that people can send some of the results from My IDP process to their PIs or mentors, somebody that they want to discuss it with. And so there's kind of a two-part question. How can you use this process of creating an individual development plan? How can you use that to have effective conversations with mentors? Mm-hmm. And then the second part of that question is, I know that there sometimes it can, depending on the relationship you have with your advisor or PI or mentor, it could lead to maybe a difficult or uncomfortable conversation, especially for the trainee. Mm-hmm. And so, the first part of it is, how do you leverage this document and this process, what you have learned in this process to have a productive conversation with a mentor that can help you meet your goals. And then if it's going to be a difficult conversation, what are some strategies that people can use to still make it productive?
So one thing I've seen work successfully from the students and postdocs I've talked to around the country about IDPs is that one mentor is not enough. And sometimes your primary mentor or PI, depending on the situation, may not be the best person for you to have your IDP conversation with. And so, you know, I know in some lab settings, the PI says everyone does it's like the Angela DePace paper that I mentioned that I hope everyone reads. It's very structured and formal, and it sounds like that I think the PI drives the process. I want everyone to do an IDP. We take this really seriously. I'm going to meet with you one-on-one and really coach you through this career development process and be very supportive. Maybe that's the ideal situation, but if that's not your situation, maybe you need to, you know, have a one-on-one conversation with someone else whose feedback you also respect and can maybe have more time with, or whatever the situation might be. So I think sometimes multiple mentors or someone who's not even your own primary PI might be the best person to have an IDP conversation with. And then how to make it the most productive, I think one tip would be, it may seem obvious, but a lot of people don't do this. Don't make it a casual conversation. I think talking to a potential mentor and saying, hey, you know, I've been thinking about my career and what's next for me and how I'm going to get there, and trying to plan out some goals for the next year. It'd be really helpful if I could sit down with a cup of coffee with you and, you know, have a chat about my goals. And so setting up a formal time, try to get away from the lab, whether it's your lab or someone else's lab if you're seeking another mentor, so that you can have a really focused private conversation. Another suggestion would be to come to the meeting with a very high level, with a piece of paper or whatever kind of document that's very high level, not your complete IDP. So, you know, a lot of people's IDP products turned out to be like month by month what I'm going to do, and you may have 7 or 8 things per month. I think that's way too much to share with someone who you're trying to get mentoring advice. So I would say go with a couple of points you want to cover with that person, a couple pieces of advice. I'm going to a conference in, you know, February, and I know I need to improve my presentation skills because I've gotten invited to do a podium talk. You know, would you be willing to take 2 hours sometime between now and 4 months from now, where we could, where you'd coach me through, because I really respect your presentation skills, and I think you're a fantastic presenter. I'd really, you know, some coaching would be really helpful. It's kind of hard to say no to. You're asking for someone's, you know, 2 hours of someone's time between now and 5 months from now. They'd probably say yes to that. But if you went in with a 17-page my IDP printout and plopped it on their desk and said, I want to go over this with you, it may not go as well. So I think separate meeting, go with a high-level summary of what you want from that person, and use the third thing would be, use the phrase, could you help me with this? Can you help me with this? And I think people who you're seeking mentorship from, it's hard to say no to that. And so as long as you're not asking for something huge, you know, can you help me with something specific? You'll have some success there. I think the second part of your question was about if a PI is, if you're nervous about how that process would go, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the most common way I've heard this come up when people have talked to me about IDP discussions with a mentor is when they think their career planning process that they're going through with IDPs is pointing to a career that their PI might not be supportive of. And so let's take that situation. How might you approach that? I think that depends on how certain you are about the outcome of that discussion. I've talked to lots of people who were so super surprised when they actually had this conversation, when the PI was like, so you want to be a you know, a patent attorney, go with my blessing. You know, I want you to be successful. I have no idea how to help you, but I want to help you, you know, move on from here, and we'll get you out according to the timeline that you've been talking about. And I think that's a fantastic response from a PI, even when they can't help you and you might have been afraid of how that was going to go. But I think that conversation has to be carefully planned and talked out in advance with someone who you trust. If you have a career advisor at your institution, or other people on a thesis committee, other mentors, map out the conversation and plan out different outcomes. So I'm going to present this to my mentor. What if she says this? What if she says this? And how will I respond in these different ways? And I think that planning out of a conversation with someone who can advise you before you have it, if you're nervous about how it's going to go, pay attention to that nervousness and prepare. That would be my comment.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think something, and this is partly based on my experience. Yeah, I think it's important for you to know what is your advisor or your mentor, what are they really good at? Because, you know, you've already mentioned we need to have multiple mentors, and that's because, you know, your advisor, your research advisor, for example, they're not going to be a one-stop shop to advise you on every single thing that you want to do.
It's not possible. Yeah.
Or yeah, that you're interested in. But, you know, I think it's important that you know that person's strengths are. And then, you know, have a plan. And if you think that, you know, maybe this person is not going to be super receptive to what I'm going to say, then, you know, look for another mentor to talk about this particular issue or step or goal that you have. You know, I think one of the reasons why, you know, sometimes, or many times actually, trainees are nervous is because, you know, there are, I think this is getting a lot better, but there's still expectations about, you know, you're here training for this, therefore you're going to become somebody like me, like a PI. And that's not true anymore, that most people are going to end up in academia. So, you know, I think there also has to be an awareness of, you know, is this conversation productive? And if it's not going to be productive for me to tell my advisor everything, like I want to leave and I hate academia, you know, if it's something like that, maybe you don't want to say that, but, you know, can you get some value from still talking about your goals? You know, it's going to be important to be, as you said, to have a plan and to be strategic going into that conversation. I
think trainees have to be careful about the way they bring up plans to move into a non-academic career. If you think your PI is pretty focused on you becoming just like them, realize that a conversation could be taken, you know, you could send the message that you think they made a bad decision by becoming a PI. And I've heard this from PIs before, is that, you know, the student came in and said, I don't want to be a PI because it's such an awful life. And, you know, of course, it's not an awful life for people who love doing that. And so focusing on what you want to move your career towards, like I've weighed all my options, and here's a bunch of reasons why I think being a patent attorney would be really fascinating, is much better than I'm moving away from what I perceive to be a terrible life as a PI. So focus on what you're moving towards, not what you're moving against. And then for, I think this is more relevant for postdocs actually, for if you are quite certain that your advisor is going to respond very negatively to your announcement that you want to move into a different career path, just like Monica was saying, maybe don't have that conversation. Maybe have it with a different mentor who can advise you, period, because your advisor may not need to know everything that you're thinking in your head. And so,
Yeah.
for example, I have talked with postdocs who have observed other people in lab before them get sidelined. If they say, I'm going to go be a researcher at, Merck in the future, I hope, then suddenly all their projects get taken away, and that's perhaps not good for them either. And so pay attention and realize that maybe your PI doesn't have to know everything, but I would say 90% of the folks I talk to are glad they told their PI, because in the end, that person can be very helpful and supportive.
Wonderful. So we have another question from the audience, and I'm gonna and so, maybe you want to take some time for other professional ventures or for personal reasons after a PhD or a postdoctoral fellowship, and that affect your career down the road. And so if this is something that you want to do for whatever reason, you want to take a break after your PhD and your postdoc, how can you use the process of an IDP to plan for this so that it doesn't have a negative impact down the road?
First of all, I think the career exploration phase of doing an IDP will help you determine how much time and for what reasons time away from research or taking a break even from working period, how much impact that would have. So I think for certain career path outcomes, so I think it kind of depends on what that career exploration phase tells you. If you're like, okay, now I'm pretty certain I want to become, a science policy person, and so I'm going to talk to a bunch of people who did a 2-year AAAS fellowship and managed to work their way back into academic settings. I'm going to go sample 5 people and find out how they accomplished that. That process would tell you how wise of a move that is if your eventual career goal after policy fellowship was to get back into a faculty path. You'd want to ask people, what types of faculty positions are available after I do this? Can I be a research PI at an R1 university? Is it more likely that I could wind up at a teaching and research place or doing teaching? Geographically, does being in Washington, D.C. for 2 years restrict my? You'd want to ask a whole lot of questions of people who have gone the path before you through this career exploration phase, and that would tell you, that would help you gain more certainty and confidence about whether the eventual outcome you wanted, in this case, getting back into academia, is possible after stepping out for a while. But I think most people who want to get back into academic research after stepping out, whether it's for family purposes or an exploration into a different career path for a year or two, most of the advice I've seen and most of the experiences I've seen, most of the examples I can think of, folks have come back to some sort of a training period, even if it's a short period, to prove to a search committee for faculty positions that you are interested in. This was part of the plan all along. Do you have other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think I think it depends on what you want to do down the road. There's certain careers where it can affect you, it can have a negative impact. Academia being one example. I have talked to many people that say, well, if you take a break in between and you don't have a good explanation for it, people may question your commitment to research, which, I think it's messed up, but it's the reality. Yeah. I think if you want to take a break for whatever reason, I think it's important that you can explain it. Mm-hmm. I think if you can show productivity during that break, if it's not exactly on what you're going to do after the break, if you can show that you were productive and that you were developing skills that are going to be valuable, and if you can show that somehow that break was valuable for what you want to do, your next career move, you know, I think that puts people in a better position to take that break and say, well, yeah, I'm going to go do this, you know, this fellowship, or I'm going to go explore this completely different area. That is, you know, I really want to explore that before I settle into another career. You know, if you can explain why there's value in you doing that, and, you know, you, again, use the IDP process to plan that, and to really say, map out how this break is going to help you achieve your goals. You know, I think that puts people in a better position. I think that puts trainees in a much better position.
I agree.
Than if they're just like, you know, I'm just going to take a break. And I agree. Talk to a lot of people, or talk to a bunch of people that have done what you want to do, and can provide more practical advice. And
I think the questioner didn't say a specific amount of time that they were thinking about, but I would say if you look at general job hunting advice out there on the web, you know, there's a perception that, you know, a hole in your resume, even if it's like 6 months, is you know, you'll never get another job. And I think that's generally not true for one thing, but I think it's especially not true for people with advanced, you know, with advanced degrees. Everybody with a PhD has accomplished so much already. And if it's a short break, I don't even think you need to account for it. I've seen lots of our postdocs or students take 6 months off, or even a year off. And as long as it doesn't, you know, as long as your skills don't get rusty in that whatever period, I think for most career paths, you won't even get questioned about a lot of that. Academia is kind of the exception, but it probably matters a lot less than people think it does. Yeah.
Great. So we're almost out of time, but before we go, I wanted to ask you, you know, we've been talking about how trainees, meaning graduate students and postdocs, can use an individual development plan. But I really think that the process of self-reflection and thinking about goals, it's critical through your professional life and even before grad school. So what I wanted to ask you is, how is doing an individual development plan, how is it helpful to people that are before the training stage and people that are after, you know, people that are professionals? How is it useful in different stages of your career and training?
So if we're thinking about, you know, life sciences trainees before graduate school even, I think this IDP process can be especially helpful, you know, by focusing on those first two phases of the second. So the self-assessment and the career exploration phases. Goal setting is always great, but when you're an undergraduate, for example, your life is so prescribed by the classes you take and by the work that's kind of designated already for you to do, that you'll get through the process without a giant IDP. But I think the process of self-assessment, and if you're at an undergraduate institution, go to your career center and don't just do the My IDP exercises, but ask for to be guided with a career advisor through through a strong interest inventory, it's called, or the Strengths Finder. Both of those are really great tools that we can recommend on the Hangout website also. So do some more self-assessment, some deeper self-assessment with tools that are designed for really undergraduate level folks like the ones I mentioned, and then take the time that you have at an undergraduate institution to find out who the alumni are who have gone into different career paths, and go out and talk to people through that career exploration phase. And I'd say focus on those as the undergraduate. Once you get into, on the other side of your question, 5-10 years after all of your training, most corporate environments have some sort of a development planning process built into them. So you'll probably be required to go through with your boss, a very structured annual reflection. What have I accomplished in the last year? Let me share with my boss where I would like to go in my career, and then let's agree on what I'm going to accomplish during that year. So this IDP process is something everyone should start while they're training, and realize that they're probably going to be doing them for the rest of their careers as well.
Great. Yeah, I think it's especially, you know, after, I feel like after you leave, I mean, depending on the context, as you mentioned, but I think after you're done with your training, you're like, all right, I have a career, I'm done. And that's not,
That's not true.
necessarily true. And so, you know, I think it's great to get people thinking about how they can still benefit from this process, even when they're done with their school and their training. So that's unfortunately all the time that we have. Thank you so much, Bill, for your wisdom and for your time. You know, I wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts before we wrap up.
Just maybe quick summary that everything I know from working with people individually, with large groups, and then, you know, sort of on even the national basis, says that this career planning process is worth it, that it's productive for people, and a piece that people don't think about is that it's enjoyable as well. And when they look back on it, they're like, that was time well spent. And so I really encourage everybody to spend some time working on their IDPs.
Yes, I'm going to agree with that, and I'm also going to add that, you know, be empowered. This is your career, and so, you know,
Absolutely.
don't be afraid to take charge and to have agency, so that, you know, you can work towards what you really want to do. The other thing that I wanted to add is that I do recognize that there are people that don't have access to career counselors, sometimes at their schools, especially with smaller schools. And so for people that don't have necessarily career counselors, there are different resources online. One of them, you know, in addition to doing my IDP on the Science Careers website, there's also for people, if, you know, if there's no career counselors at your school, but you really need access to mentors, one tool is the National Research Mentoring Network, where you can find and connect with people that are that can advise you, people that are in careers that you may be interested in. So for students that are maybe at smaller schools that don't have these counseling services, that is a neat option, so that you can find people that can advise you, depending on, you know, where you want to go in your career, and what you get of the process of completing an IDP. Also, iBiology has some videos and resources from people in a diversity of careers, and offering as well. So I would definitely encourage people to visit the iBiology website. I don't know if you had any other resources online for people where they can seek mentors, or where they can seek advice if they don't have this type of service at their school.
Yeah, the two things coming to mind. One is lots of networking groups focused on different backgrounds. So depending on where you live, there's probably like an association of women in science within easy driving distance that has regular meetings and great resources and personal face-to-face mentoring available. And then it seems like most scientific conferences now have some kind of career track, career development track, and it's going to a meeting and pre-planning how you're going to seek out advice is a great use of that meeting time. And inviting someone to have a coffee with you before you even go to the meeting and telling them what you want to have the coffee with them for. You know, we have this connection scientifically, or the way our life has been, and I want to connect with you over that. Is really good use of meeting time. So I'd say use meetings and look for networking groups that you could join. Would be great resources.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Bill. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. As I mentioned, we will be posting the recording of this conversation on the iBiology website. So go look for that. We'll also add some of the resources and papers that Bill has mentioned during our conversation. So thank you for tuning in. Monica Feliu-Moher, I realized I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I am the outreach manager for iBiology. It was a pleasure to see everybody, and until next time.
Thanks, everybody.